Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As always, I'm going to give everyone a minute to log in from the waiting room, and that gives me a chance to start our closed captions, which, in spite of doing this for a year and a half, makes me nervous every time, as it takes me to a separate screen, and then the closed captions come up, and I'm always afraid something's going to go sideways, but all right, now I can take a breath. You should see a red live button on your screen, and if you click on that, you can follow along with the closed captions on a separate screen. So happy Friday, everyone. I'm Christy Baglow, the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services, and I'm really excited to have with us today, bright and early California time, we've got Eric Harris and Parisa Ijadi. I knew I was going to mess it up. Masudi. They are from Disability Rights California, so I appreciate them joining us first thing in the morning for this. And Eric is going to be speaking us today about disability justice, specifically intersectional identities. So I'm really excited to learn from him today. We did not have time to get CLE approved before the webinar, so I will send that out as soon as it gets approved. And I'll also send the recording and the PowerPoint out after the presentation, because I know Eric has a lot of good resources in there. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Eric.
Thank you so much, Christy. It's wonderful to be here this morning or this afternoon for you all. But my name is Eric Harris. I use pronouns he, him, and I'm the Public Policy Director at Disability Rights California. And I'll talk a little bit more about my background and my bio, and also give a little bit of information about Disability Rights California and the work that we do. But Parisa, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you, Eric. Hi, everybody. My name is Parisa Ujedi Maksudi. I'm a senior attorney with Disability Rights California in the Intellectual and Developmental Disability Practice Group, and I'm a litigator. As Eric will discuss today, we are very much looking forward to increasing the framing of disability rights, disability justice into all of the work we do, from direct impact cases to our larger impact litigation. Thanks, Eric.
Absolutely. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, and it's going to be a PowerPoint presentation. But one thing that I do want to do, and something that the disability community encourages, and it's not just something that is important for certain people with certain disabilities, but all different types of disabilities, all different types of potential impairments, is kind of describe how I appear on the screen. So I'm an African-American male with medium to dark brown skin. I have short black hair. I also have a beard and mustache, and I'm wearing glasses. I'm also wearing a kind of turquoise colored polo shirt with a white undershirt. And I'm in a room that has white walls with a white door, with a mirror behind me. Reflecting off of that mirror is a window. And that's something that the disability community encourages. It's just an inclusive issue in terms of making sure that especially people who are blind or low vision have an opportunity to know exactly what is on their screen. And so I wanted to at least just mention that as an example, and for anybody who is blind or low vision, so that they have an opportunity to know what's on the screen. But I can go ahead and display my screen. I'll go ahead and do that now. So disability justice, and my name is Eric Harris, and Director of Public Policy. just to give a little bit of background on myself, I was born in the Bay Area, in Berkeley, California, and grew up in both Berkeley in the Bay Area and Sacramento. For those of you and all of you are in Florida, so Northern California is kind of broken up a little bit into the Bay Area, which of course is San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, San Jose, um, and other kind of smaller towns. And then Sacramento is the state capital, and that's where I grew up. I grew up in a family of public servants. So my mother and both my grandmothers are teachers and educators. And and my dad is an attorney. But he's been a civil rights attorney throughout his career. So I have always just been used to public service, and politics and policy was always a way that we viewed public service in action. I was born with a physical disability. I was born with congenital hip dislocation. So I had to have multiple surgeries when I was a young child, and use a wheelchair to this day, because I found out about adaptive sports, wheelchair sports that I was able to play. And ever since then, I started using a wheelchair more often. Um, as far as my adaptive sports background, um, I played wheelchair basketball for a group in the Bay Area called Bay Area Outreach Recreational Program, BORP. At the time when I was young in the early 2000s, they were the only adaptive sports program for kids in Northern California. So even though I lived in Sacramento, about an hour and a half away from Berkeley, I would take the train every day to Berkeley to participate in wheelchair sports with my friends and with my colleagues. We happened to have a really, really good team when I was in high school, and we competed for two national championships and winning one of them. And so during that period, I was recruited and ended up playing in college at the University of Arizona, and traveled to all over the country and even internationally to play. Um, I spent a lot of my time while I was in college and law school, interning at different political organizations, campaigns, local politics, nonprofits. I was really fortunate that my parents were able to support me while I was in high school and in the period in college, when I really wanted to gain experience, that I was able to do these internships and kind of have opportunities nationally as well as statewide and locally, in different organizations, including working with United States Representative Barbara Lee, who represents Berkeley and Oakland, and then also doing policy work at the state level for the California State NAACP, for a couple of years as well. Disability rights. So traditionally, and this picture is much more kind of in the front and center in terms of having disabled people involved in the movement and really active. Um, and you see on this picture, you have a number of wheelchair users, you have a number of folks who are standing up. You can tell that there's some range of disability. But the disability movement, the disability rights movement, began with individuals with disabilities, especially in the 70s, really advocating for accessibility and opportunity. All of these kind of um, uh, pushes in terms of the movement, the disability rights movement, especially in the Bay Area of California, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, really pushing hard for disability rights, equal treatment under the law. and having opportunities for employment, having opportunities for housing, transportation, all of these spaces and services. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was a law that was signed by George H.W. Bush in 1990. And we actually just had this past week, the 31st anniversary of the signing of the ADA, which was a monumental law that really impacted so many in the disability community. And I don't have a picture of it here, but but you can imagine the signing of the ADA had George H.W. Bush, at the time, Bob Dole, Senator Tom Harkin, other leaders in Congress at the time, and some folks with disabilities. This was in 1990, and the picture essentially had all men, all white men, a couple of wheelchair users, but basically it is a certain perspective in terms of the disability rights movement, people with disabilities in the United States. Let me go to the next slide. So in this next slide, this disability justice picture, as you all can see, it is a very diverse group of people. You have some folks sitting, some folks standing, a woman with a hijab. You have different people of different races and ethnicities. You have a lot of Black and brown people. And disability justice advocates that this is what disability looks like, and this is who should be leading the disability movement. The argument being that the disability rights movement, had been led by mostly white, mostly straight, mostly heterosexual men for a really long time, and that disability justice advocates that disabled people, especially disabled people of color, especially members of the LGBTQIA plus community, should be the ones who are leading this movement. So Disability Rights California is a nonprofit protection and advocacy organization that advocates on behalf of all people in California with disabilities. We have about 300 staff, and 100 of them are attorneys. We have 26 offices throughout the state. We have offices in San Diego. We have offices in the Central Valley. We have offices in Oakland. Sacramento is our main large office. But we are distributed throughout the state. And one of the really cool things about Disability Rights California is that we are connected with other protection and advocacy organizations throughout the country. There's one protection and advocacy organization in each of the 50 states and each territory. And then we're all under an umbrella of the National Disability Rights Network, NDRN, which is located in Washington, D.C., and they do most of the congressional kind of work, working with Congress, working with the White House to ensure that that our voices are heard there as well. So DRC works for a world where all people have power, all disabled people have power and are treated with dignity and respect in this world. People with disabilities are supported, valued, included in their communities, afforded the same opportunities as people without disabilities, and make their own decisions. That's been that whole statement, but especially being included in their own communities, making their own decisions is really about what disability justice is. It's ensuring that disabled people are leading, that they're not just clients, that they're not just the people who are the ones impacted, but they're the ones who are making the decisions at the table. How we accomplish this goal is prioritizing equity, accountability, resources, connection, and visibility, and accessibility on all platforms and settings. I'm really glad that you all have prioritized closed captioning. That's something, that using Zoom has been really important, especially, of course, for the deaf and hard of hearing community. But closed captioning can be beneficial for everyone with and without disabilities. Some people just have a harder time processing what they hear. And so it makes it easier for them if they're able to also read what is being said on the screen. So I wanted to mention that because we should take these ideas for accessibility wherever we go moving forward. One of the concerns of the disability community is that now, well, we'll see kind of what happens with the pandemic, but the pandemic has brought some good in terms of ideas of more accessibility, more opportunities for disabled people to not have to travel far, and more accessible options for work, so that people can work from home. People can kind of choose what fits best for them. And of course, disabled people are also immunocompromised generally, many of us. So it's an opportunity for us to stay safe during a pandemic such as this. So accessibility on all platforms, accessibility in how we do things is just really crucial. So there are a couple of videos that I wanted to show you all. Let me go ahead and do that. The first one is on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Let me go ahead and click on that real quick. Okay, let me share this. And please let me know if you all are not able to hear this.
Marks the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a groundbreaking law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. The legislation has been invaluable for what it changed, but significant obstacles still exist for those who have physical or mental impairments of any kind. When President George H.W. Bush signed the law in 1990, it guaranteed new protections for work, education, access, and transportation, among other rights. Many of the physical accommodations that are now commonplace only came to pass after the ADA became law. In fact, as seen in the Netflix documentary Crip Camp, it took longer to guarantee these basic civil rights than it did for other groups, including Black Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And a generation of advocates took to the streets to demonstrate and protest through the 1970s and 80s. But even after all this time, the challenges for people with disabilities remain enormous. Just 32% of working-age Americans with disabilities have a job. People with disabilities also live in poverty at more than twice the rate of people without disabilities. We're going to explore these questions more in a moment. But first, the NewsHour spoke with a number of Americans and asked them to reflect on what it means to live with a disability today.
My name is Brittany Wilson. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I'm a Disabled civil rights attorney. I have cerebral palsy.
Hi, my name is Bill Krebs. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm a person with a disability myself. You may not know it. It's a hidden disability.
My name is Elizabeth Bostic. I am first and foremost the proud parent and humble servant of King James. He has a rare disease called kernicterus, which is caused by severe jaundice at birth.
I'm Jen Deerenwater. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. I'm also bisexual two-spirit, and I am multiply disabled with chronic illnesses.
My name is Alice Wong, and I'm a disabled activist in San Francisco.
My name is Max Barrows. I am a person on the autism spectrum. I speak up for people with disabilities throughout the state.
I think it's safe to say that my life wouldn't be anything that it is right now because the ADA literally gave me my rights as a disabled person. The fact that I was able to attend law school and receive accommodations and to be employed as an attorney. But I think also as a civil rights lawyer in particular, I know the limitations of the law. And that's what the ADA is. At the end of the day, it's just a statute. It gave us the bare minimum, which is our rights. And rights are not anything if they're not enforceable.
Well, before that, the ADA, kids like myself were segregated in school. We didn't have no education. We were never heard, never seen, never did anything. Employment was the hardest thing for people with disabilities. We were placed in shelter workshop programs where we just sat there and did nothing. We did some minimum wage jobs. We made a whole dollar. Wow. I was there for 10 years of my life. I thought as a person with a disability, I would go nowhere. So I started being a self-advocate.
When I think about ADA, the key word for me is access. And that coupled with a number of other disability laws really gave everyone the ability to have access to whatever tools were necessary, any reasonable accommodations were necessary to be able to live as independently as possible. And so as his mother, of course, one of my primary concerns is, can he effectively communicate his wants, his needs, his desires, to live the life that he wants to live and to be in charge of it. And so a lot of technology has been built as a result of that because there was a demand for it.
One of the caveats of the ADA was to try to stop the institutionalization of disabled people. Well, that's not really ended. Yes, we do have more options, but disabled people are being institutionalized all the time. I can't tell you the number of times I've had medical providers or, healthcare workers try to put me in a nursing home. I don't need to be in a nursing home. Just make sure I have a disability accessible apartment and a home health aide, and I can mostly get by on my own.
I do think, especially with the pandemic, my right to health care and to be protected from discrimination is really important. I am legit worried about coming down with COVID-19 and not being a priority or considered a life worth saving. And these attitudes will not be fixed by a law. These are longer, more difficult cultural changes that need to happen. And that takes time.
We're still not seen as independent or productive people in many areas because we rarely are given the opportunity to prove ourselves. And people should let us be in the driver's seat of making decisions for ourselves. And who knows us better than we know ourselves?
So that video, I think, really embodies.
Don't book a cheap hotel.
Really embodies what the disability movement had been, and really kind of gives a good background. I know that they mentioned the documentary Crip Camp, and I hope that you all have an opportunity to check that documentary out. It's very, very powerful. It's on Netflix, so it's available for most folks. But it was just a really good story of the beginning of the disability movement. Judy Heumann, who is a world-renowned disability advocate is featured in the documentary. And it talks about a camp that kids with disabilities would attend, and just how that the attitudes and the pride that came with that, how that developed into the disability movement. The next video that I want to show really quickly is on disability justice, intersectionality, and disability justice. So, intersectionality, the idea is that disabled people, people with disabilities, are also intersect with different genders, different races and ethnicities, and in some cases, multiple. And so it's important that we don't just think of disability on its own, but that we understand that somebody who has a mental health disability, who's also Black, is going to face a different level of discrimination or issues in terms of dealing with the education system, the justice system, um, and it's important that as advocates we understand that somebody with a mental health disability who's white, and who might not appear to have a disability at all, they will be treated differently than somebody who has multiple disabilities, who is Latinx or AAPI, and just kind of how those dynamics come into play. So let me go ahead and play this video for you real quickly.
So disability justice.
Let's see.
So disability justice is a term that was coined by Patty Byrne and the Disability Justice Collective, which was this amazing crew of disabled, badass, mostly queer and trans people of color. Disability justice is really looking at creating a world where every body, every mind, regardless of how it's shaped or moves or functions in the world, has a place and understands that disabled folks have a lot to offer to our communities. And in the same vein, it's grounded in the agency and self-determination of a person who identifies, like I identify as neurodivergent, that my agency and self-determination is prioritized over, right, things like the medical industrial complex or saying that there's something wrong with me. Transformative justice is also about agency and self-determination, right? And people have understanding that we are all empowered to change our lives and to change behaviors and to transform the culture that we live in. Disability justice is also trying to transform the culture that we live in to be, bigger and allow for more agency and self-determination from more of us. So that intersection is a super sweet spot because, we're all fighting for that same thing, which is that we get to exist in the world without fear of harm just because of who we are or how we move through the world. As someone with who's neurodivergent and with disabilities, a lot of how I entered into this work was through my own lived experience of trying to be accountable to my community and be able to show up for my community as someone who very frequently has to take moves back because of how my mind and my body function, but also for care to become a collective thing. Disabled folks, we've never been able to rely on a lot of the systems that are in place, or those systems have been incredibly harmful to us. More than 50% of people who are murdered by the police are people with neurodivergence or who are neuroatypical or have cognitive disabilities, right? So for disabled community, this is also about us staying alive. I think everyone should have a safety team. Everyone should have a community that loves them enough and unconditionally. Having a safety team has enabled me to be outside, to be a part of my community. And it also is a preventative tool. My friends know how to support me and take care of me so that I don't end up outside while I'm dissociated or episodic, which means I have less interactions with police officers, which means I have a lesser chance of ending up back inside or really harmed by the state or the system. So when I think about transformative justice and community accountability, and again, that intersection, right, is like, this is really about going back to what we know is true, that our relationships are the most valuable resource that we have in maintaining our agency and self-determination, in getting the love and care and support we need to survive, and in shifting our culture kind of from the inside out.
From a disability perspective, so many of us who are disabled live in a lot of isolation because of ableism. So, and I mean, that can happen for people who aren't disabled too. I think that's true for a lot of survivors and a lot of people, that they're like, what community? So I guess I also want to give a shout out, because I think, community is a word in community accountability, right? And I think often there is still this focus we have on oh my God, this great network of community is going to be there and it's so wonderful. And a lot of us actually have a much more mixed experience, or we're actually, we're loners, we're hermits, there's a lot of stuff that we don't actually have support around, or we're actually kind of isolated. And I guess I kind of want to give a shout out to people who might be watching this video who are living alone in their apartments or their lives, who are still building lives that have safety, peace, justice, and healing, and to say that that's real too.
So those were a couple of videos. Let me go ahead and switch again. Sorry for a little bit of a delay. But those were just a couple of videos to kind of explain to everyone, that what the disability justice movement is and how it is a little different than disability rights. I know that I hadn't been doing this yet, but let me go ahead and do the slideshow so that it appears a little bigger on your screen. So disability justice, this is, disability justice is, as was described in the video, is about the idea that disabled people are at the center, and disabled people should be leading, and that disabled people, especially who intersect with other identities, should be the main focus. And disability justice is often viewed as a more kind of extreme, a more progressive version of disability rights. There are a number, what I did want to include here is that there are a number of disability justice leaders. And this initial group with Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, and Leroy Moore, these folks were the beginning. And honestly, the disability justice movement is not that old. The ADA, of course, was signed in 1990, and disability justice kind of came about over the last decade or so, where disabled people viewed the Americans with Disabilities Act and said, we can do better than this. And we experienced a lot of discrimination within the disability community. A lot of the issues that we care about were not being prioritized. And so disability justice kind of gave us an opportunity, and is giving us an opportunity to really let the issues come to the forefront that, those of us who are at the intersections experience on a more regular basis. And it's also, in a larger sense, recognizing privilege. So even though, I'm a Black man with a disability, I know that there are certain elements of me, especially of my disability, that is of privilege. So I am a wheelchair user, but I'm also somebody who can push my own wheelchair. I'm also somebody who who has the benefit of health insurance, has the benefit of being supported by family and being educated in college, kind of in the traditional sense, in law school. There are a number, of course, and I'm also fortunate enough to be employed. The videos showed that only 32% of disabled people are employed. I mean, and that is a number that's basically stayed the same for generations. Um, and uh, and so all of these kind of recognizing my privilege and recognizing when I don't need to be the person who is the only voice in the room, even for the disability community. There are folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who need to have more of a voice. Those who have mental health disabilities who need to have more of a voice. Um, and so all of these issues are discussed in the disability justice movement. So disability justice has 10 principles. I won't go in too much depth because I know, I've shown you guys the videos and we've kind of discussed this, but intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted. We've talked a little bit about that, led by those who know these systems and are closest to these systems. So having people who have an intellectual disability talk about the rights of those with intellectual disabilities, not providers or parents or doctors or scientists, but those who actually have intellectual disabilities. Anti-capitalist politic, and this is an idea that is similar in other spaces, whether it's Black Lives Matter or other social justice organizations, that capitalism is a main reason why disabled people are in a difficult spot. The fact that our value, our worth is based on how much money we can make at work is an issue that, excuse me, that the disability community has been advocating, at least in the disability justice space, advocating against for a really long time. That we are more than just what we can provide in terms of work. One of the speakers in the video talked about sheltered workshops. Some people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are placed in a segregated setting of a sheltered workshop where they make less than minimum wage, which was a law that Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed back during the age right after the Great Depression. And the idea was that people with certain disabilities, to get them into the workplace, that they wanted to encourage employers, and by allowing the employers to pay less than minimum wage, they thought that would kind of give folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities more opportunities. Unfortunately, that's been taken advantage of, and a lot of people are making $2-3 an hour. But the whole idea that your productivity is the basis for how much money you make, or how what your value is to society, is something that disability justice is against. Commitment to a cross movement organizing. So the idea that ableism, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia are all part of the problem, and that joining all of these movements together is an important idea, an important process. Recognizing wholeness. So recognizing, of course, that people are more than just their physical appearance, or more than their mental health, or more than their background or ethnicity, their gender, but it's all part of a wholeness of who these people are. Few more. So sustainability. We the idea that these experiences are all part of an ongoing justice and liberation, and it's part of a long-term idea. We have to pace ourselves and understand how we can work together in this. Commitment to cross-disability solidarity. So I mentioned earlier, I'm a wheelchair user, and it's important that I recognize that wheelchair users should not be the only voices, but that wheelchair users, those with chronic pain, those with mental health disabilities, those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we're all in this movement together. Um, Interdependence, meeting others' needs, we build towards liberation, know that state solutions extended to further control over our lives. Of course, the most prevalent examples are with law enforcement and people with mental health disabilities um, being incarcerated. But also we see this with the Britney Spears situation. Britney Spears has a disability. Her family and her family has made the decision that she needed to be under a conservatorship. She's lost control over her own decisions. Her not only her decisions with her money, but also in that situation, she's had an IUD forced into her, so she cannot make the decision anymore to have children, and other decisions about her life that she's not able to make. And just the idea that we should have control over our own lives. Collective access, pretty self-explanatory, that we should all have as Black people with disabilities. Of course, queer people with disabilities, we should all have access, full access, and it should go nuance that goes beyond able-bodied and minded normativity to be a community with each other. Collective liberation, nobody or mine can be left behind. So we all have to group together, and that's how we can accomplish revolution in the ideas of disability justice. And then the final slide, we can all be better. I placed this and I can send it actually in an email, but there are a list of resources, articles, kind of write-ups, books, websites that give a lot of great information on this idea of disability justice. And essentially that people with disabilities do not need to be fixed, that we do not need a cure, that we can and should be able to live in society as we are, and that society is essentially the problem. The fact that a building only has stairs is not a wheelchair user's fault, but it is the building and society knowing that people with disabilities might want to enter, and that making the building more accessible is how we should always think first, as opposed to on the back end, as opposed to, oh, let's put in this ramp now 20 years later. As a society, we all have to be better about being inclusive and thinking about accessibility as we kind of start our processes. So I'm available for any questions, and I know Parisa is also very knowledgeable, of course, as an attorney in our IDD practice group. But thank you for having me today, and I'm here to answer any questions that you might have. Let me go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was a really fascinating presentation. I really appreciate you educating us, and the videos were great. You did all the tech perfectly, which is more than I can say. Everyone's used to the tech snafus by now. I don't want to forget to thank Afrasan Adams at Bay Area Legal Services. He's the one who connected me with Eric and Parisa, so I really appreciate that connection and being able to bring this information to everyone. We did have a couple questions come in. Do you have examples of how a disability justice mindset and knowledge of the issues can assist attorneys to better identify legal issues during client intake, better advocate for their clients, and better serve the legal community?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So As attorneys, I think that it is always important to understand what the community wants. Of course, I'm thinking of this as a public policy person, but it's the same as, in my opinion, from a litigator's perspective or from an attorney's perspective, that community lawyering, movement lawyering, that knowing what the community needs is always going to be the best way in doing any civil rights work. Not assuming that we know because we're educated in at a certain level in a traditional sense, or because we have some experience in this space that we should be the ones who are making the final calls on any of this, but that we're actually going to the community, finding out from them how we can be helpful. I think that that's a way that um, I've approached policy work. I don't think that it is right for me to come up with bills or laws that we should be working on without actually communicating with disabled people first and making sure that what we're working on lines up with what they actually need and want at this time. So I think kind of erasing any assumptions is probably a good way to start, and reaching out, and from a disability sense, reaching out to disabled people when it comes to these ideas. It's the same if we were, as attorneys, if you're working on an issue that impacts women's rights, you would want to communicate with women and find out what they need and what they want. It wouldn't make sense to only talk to men, right? Like, it wouldn't make sense to only to kind of ignore the population that you're trying to help, but to actually communicate and work with the groups that you're trying to work with.
That makes sense. I think we as attorneys like to have all the answers and tell people what to do sometimes. So it's another reminder to slow down and see what the client wants and don't make assumptions about what they want. Great advice. The next question is, does your work enter into the realm of the experience of parents with disabilities who end up in the child welfare system with their children?
Yeah, so we do work with anyone in California who has a disability. So it's interesting because a lot of the work that we do is system based. So it's figuring out ways to address systemic problems. And occasionally, and I know, Parisa can probably speak to this as well. But occasionally we work on individual cases, individual issues. But to a larger extent, it's figuring out how we can address systemic problems. But if we do have parents with disabilities, elders with disabilities, we work with the aging community, but it's really a range. We are funded by the State Bar of California and the federal government to do this work, and so fortunately, we have a pretty wide range of the work that we can do in terms of helping all people with all disabilities. And so there are circumstances where we're helping parents with disabilities, as well as seniors, and those in care facilities. Over the last year and a half, we've really tried to focus on people who are immunocompromised, making sure that they're kept safe and that they have access to vaccines, and all of the resources that folks without disabilities have.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you were showing the videos, first of all, it's hard to believe that the Americans with Disabilities Act is only 31 years old. It's younger than me. And I couldn't help but think that here in Florida, so many things impact someone's ability to be independent. For instance, the lack of good public transportation. You treat that like it's not really a big deal. Okay, it might not be a big deal for me. I can be independent because I have a car. But I'm assuming that's a huge barrier to work in a lot of places.
Yeah, no doubt. And in California, of course, California is so spread out and large. People often think about San Francisco or Los Angeles, but even, I mean, Los Angeles is super spread out. LA County is one of the largest counties in the country, if not the largest county in the country, in terms of area. Um, and public transportation is a major issue, and it's one of the and it's interesting because we not only, of course, have to advocate for public transportation to be available, but also that it's fully accessible, um, and and accessible for people with all different types of disabilities, not just wheelchair users, but people who are deaf and hard of hearing, people who are blind, and one of the pieces that disability justice advocates for is that it's important that as a society, we are better about accessibility across the board so that we don't have to do like individual trainings for each public transportation system in the state or in the country, that we don't have to do these trainings for the folks who put the public transportation in certain parts of a city or in certain parts of a state, that this is already being thought about and already considered in all of the work that we do. Because disability is a part of everything. It's a part of housing, it's a part of employment, transportation, anything you can think about, climate change, obviously criminal justice reform, anything you can think about, there's a disability element in all of it. So I'm glad you brought up public transportation.
It's fascinating. Parisa, did you want to hop in? I don't know if you have any experience with cases in the child welfare system.
Sure. So I don't have experience with that, but I know some cases that come across the IDD practice group, the Intellectual and Developmental Disability Practice Group, include issues involving parents who have intellectual or developmental disabilities and are treated, of course, in an unfair manner, given their disabilities. So in a discriminatory manner because of their disabilities rather than their ability to care for their children. So the stereotypes permeate all of our systems. But on the last question that I'm seeing, which is regarding examples of cases, Eric, if you don't mind me sharing about the COVID litigation. So in the region I'm from, in Southern California, a case that's on my mind right now when that disability rights movement case question came up is a case involving housing options for unhoused individuals during the pandemic. And so we have pending litigation on behalf of unhoused individuals who in our region are more likely to be Black, to be brown, to be people with disabilities that render them at higher risk for not only complications, but also death from COVID than the general population. And yet during the pandemic, our local governments, while they were directing housed people who were less likely to have these disabilities, who were less racial minorities, they were directing housed people to shelter in place and not congregate, right? So the general advice. And so, for example, for housed individuals displaced by our notorious California wildfires, these housed individuals were given hotel vouchers, whereas in the past they would be sent to YMCAs and schools to stay. And yet during this time, people with disabilities, again, who are disproportionately Black and brown and with disabilities that render them at higher risk of harm, if infected, they were directed to a mega congregate shelter against all of the advice of the local authorities. So they were treated in a way that was very different from the general population. So there was a disregard for their health and safety, treating them as second-class citizens. And so we have litigation pending regarding this issue because our clients were not able to access a congregate shelter because they were given advice by their physicians. And in addition to that, the region actually conditioned services and permanent housing on being in the shelter. So the disregard for individuals' health and safety when you are experiencing the intersectional systems of oppression in our society were absolutely at play during the pandemic, at a time when programs funded to help prevent harm were actually used in a very different way for people at most risk. And so that's a case that's pending that I feel is very much in line with our disability justice movement. And Eric, I'm sure there's multiple others you can speak about if there's time.
No, that was a great example. You all can imagine how the multiple, and I know you all are in Florida, but in California, of course, dealing with the issues relating to COVID, along with the issues relating to fires. Now, in our state, we deal with large fires in Northern and Southern California for almost half of the year. It's almost from about June through October and November. And a large part of that is because, of course, as a state, we've been in a drought for a number of years now. And from a disability perspective, dealing with that, not only, of course, from a homelessness issue, from a power shutoff. So rolling blackouts have to happen in California. So we have to constantly work on issues relating to making sure that people with disabilities who are on ventilators, people with disabilities who need power, have advocates pushing on their behalf to ensure that they are either given enough notice or that they have backup generators or whatever other options there might be. But all of these issues, especially during the pandemic, have really kind of been coming to the forefront. And Disability Rights California has kind of taken on a number of different issues that we might not have always taken on in the past, but because of kind of the current circumstances, there's been a lot more of balancing of all of these things.
Yeah, that's really interesting what Parisa said about basically having to go to a huge shelter, which is a huge risk of COVID, in order to get other services. Something else, I don't know if you've been seeing it over there, but here, as a way to deal with COVID and try to be a little bit safe, a lot of things are drive-through now, like drive-through only, drive-through food, drive-through school supplies, which sounds great if you have a car and if you can drive the car. But that kind of worries me for people who didn't have cars or were not able to drive them before the pandemic. And now if it moves to completely that model, like they literally say no walk-ups, no one out of their car. I'm like, okay, well that excludes a lot of people who can't afford to have a car. So that seems counterproductive. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, thank you so much for that presentation. Do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share with everybody? Just things to keep in mind?
Just as far as things to keep in mind is you never know who is living with a disability. Of course, those who are wheelchair users, those who kind of have a physical outward appearing disability, that might be one thing. But you never know who has an intellectual developmental disability or who has a mental health disability. And so including accessibility in all of the work that you all do is going to be really, really important. I mean, we've seen it examples, and I don't know how much you all are paying attention to the Olympics, but of course, with the recent kind of recent athletes who have expressed that they are dealing with mental health disabilities, and we've students in schools, parents, and especially coming out of a pandemic or during a pandemic, we're all still in it. During a pandemic, we don't know how this is going to impact people, especially isolation, especially just being scared, dealing with trauma. All of these elements come into play when we're talking about disability. President Biden, I believe yesterday or the day before, said that long COVID will be viewed potentially as a disability. And so that, is going to include so many more people who didn't have a disability before and now are going to have disabilities moving forward. And that's another thing to kind of keep in mind too, to kind of finish off. Disability can be obtained at any point in your life. You can develop obviously any physical disability in terms of an injury. You can kind of have low vision, you can lose your vision, lose your hearing. You can also obtain a mental health disability at any point. So just the ideas of accessibility and inclusion, when you're looking for folks to help, when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, include accessibility too. All of these things I think are just important. Just keep disability in mind and when you're doing the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. You've definitely given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your expertise with us. So thank you so much, Eric and Parisa, and thank you, Afrasan Adams, for connecting us all for this presentation. I'll send out the recording in the PowerPoint tomorrow, and this will also go up on our YouTube channel so you can share it with anyone who missed it. Thank you both so much. I hope you have a good weekend. Bye-bye.